Hello, welcome to episode 49 of the PHP Town Hall podcast. You have myself, Ben Edmonds, and my buddy Phil Sturgeon.
Hello.
Back from like a 2-month hiatus while we've been traveling and being lazy in general. This episode we have Anthony Ferrara returning. Beau Simensen, I believe you've been on like twice now, Beau?
Yep.
And Woody Gilk for his first appearance. So welcome, Woody.
Thank you. You'll have to excuse my voice. My wife gave me some sort of throat thing, and so I'm drinking my tea and trying to get through it.
All right. I like your mug there.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I got
Wait, what's on the mug for those listening at home in black and white?
It says featured speaker. It's from Atlanta PHP.
Very nice. Classy gift.
All right, so today we're going to delve into the PSR-15, which is about middlewares. So I guess first we're going to delve into a little bit about what's the history behind it, what is it trying to solve, things like that. So I'll go ahead and serve it up to, I guess, Beau to throw in on what is PSR-15.
Yeah, so PSR-15 is FIG's attempt to address the question of standardizing HTTP middleware. One of the big complaints that we had with PSR-7 was that it didn't really do anything with any sort of like interfaces for interacting with the messages. So between clients and servers, there was really no standard way to do any of those interactions. So after a year of people playing with stuff in the wild, FIG's now turning its attention to trying to solve this problem and sort of looking at what's happened over the last year with people building these sorts of applications and these sorts of systems, and trying to figure out what to do to see if we can standardize it, or see if FIG can standardize it.
I know it's a little bit tough to explain exactly because it's kind of speaking code out loud, but what is the main benefit of standardizing the middleware, kind of the handlers or whatever? What is it that's being standardized in this that isn't achieved by PSR-7? Because there's a lot of middleware implementations already that do handle middleware in PHP, but what is the point of 15 compared to 7?
So the main difference is that most of the middleware implementations that I've seen in the wild have all just been standardizing around a callback signature, being passed in a request, a response, and then a callable to pass on to the next middleware. Most of the implementations that I've seen have followed this, but not all of them have exactly, and not everyone has liked that format. So if you want to build a middleware right now, it's not necessarily clear to anybody how they should do that. So in order to be able to make that more clear, we can standardize it so that people can say, all right, if I write this middleware, it's actually going to be compatible with anybody that's trying to do PSR-7-based middleware, as opposed to whatever the flavor of the week is. If someone else just does something differently tomorrow, then your middleware won't work with that framework or that base application.
Yeah, and that seems like a pretty powerful thing because there's a bunch of implementations out there, right? There's StackPHP, which you were involved with, one of the main people on, and things like that. So like a StackPHP middleware just won't work in a middleware built by somebody else. And I think both Woody and Anthony have both built middleware systems, and it just doesn't fit in the square hole. So that seems like a pretty powerful thing if we can just take middlewares and just share them with anyone, right?
Right. I think part of the big power that we saw happen with PSR-7 and the early adopters is we ended up with this very rich ecosystem that's growing all the time of micro frameworks that were based around PSR-7, and a lot of those components you could take from one framework and put them into another framework, and for the most part they would just work. And that was largely due to this sort of de facto adoption of a middleware signature, which we call the double pass system, where you pass in both a request and a response. And because it was all based around the PSR-7 interfaces, for the most part, things worked really well. Which was, if we go back to StackPHP, the entire goal, StackPHP worked because we had Symfony, HTTP kernel, and so you could take one StackPHP implementation and go somewhere else with it, and it would work just fine as long as it was based around those HTTP kernel interfaces. Since that's not what PSR-7 is, it's a different set of interfaces, but it's the same general concept, and so that's the situation we see today in PSR-7 adopters and frameworks.
If one way you can look at it, if you are familiar with the Symfony ecosystem, is that PSR-7 could be considered something like HTTP Foundation, whereas PSR-15 would be more considered HTTP kernel. So it's adding that extra bit of logic to actually facilitate communicating using the messages themselves.
Exactly. Yeah, and I mean, I see, the reason I got involved and proposed HTTP middleware, although I can't take full credit for it. It's something that's been floating out there. I was basically just the one that said, all right, let's do this thing, and started writing it up in a meta document. But HTTP middleware, we had this. There was such a growing ecosystem, and it was really cool to see all the different stuff that people were doing. I mean, there are some community people out there on GitHub who had written, 12 or so different middlewares and just published them for people to make use of however they wanted. And the only dependency was a PSR-7 implementation, which is just awesome to see that kind of sharing happening out there.
So one question people have posed is, why not just use Symfony's middleware components? Why do really a separate implementation or standard?
I mean, I think the simple answer is because Symfony is not compatible with PSR-7. There's a bridge, and people could certainly use that bridge to kind of make use of newer PSR-7 based stuff within Symfony, but that's a one-directional system as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, let's take the question back a little bit further. It's not necessarily something I agree with, but it's something I hear a lot, and it's, the FIG's stupid because X. Everyone has a FIG stupid because X, but one of the most popular ones recently has been, the FIG's stupid because they did PSR-7 instead of just using Symfony HTTP Foundation or Kernel, whichever. And so, kind of jumping off of kind of PSR HTTP middleware for a second and back to PSR-7. Anyone who feels like answering the question, why do you think the FIG chose to make PSR-7 for representing a message instead of just like slapping a PSR logo on the existing Symfony implementation? Was it because the Symfony stuff was broken? Was it because the FIG was bored and wanted to do something? Why does anyone think that was done that way?
Do you really see Zend adopting Symfony's HTTP implementation or Kohana or Cake or anything like that? I think a lot of it comes down to ego and these vertical markets that we have set up within our ecosystems that people just don't want to play ball like that. Whereas if you do something through FIG, you have this kind of middle ground where everyone is equal. Certainly there are certainly bigger players within the FIG group itself that can sort of like push certain agendas in certain ways if they want to. But for the most part, if everyone is building to PSR-7 as opposed to everyone now having to bow down and accept Symfony's HTTP Foundation, I just don't think that was going to work. Other people might disagree, but I just don't see that ever happening really.
Yeah, I mean, there'll be some knee-jerk responses to that, which are like, these people are ridiculous. The people running these projects are muppets. They can't share and collaborate and whatever else. But the larger thing of it is, do you really want to have your project requiring a dependency in a very third-party place where they could just change it? They could be like, we know that you've just built version 9 of Drupal around this thing, but we've just dropped support for that and we've recoded it and we've got version 5 that's completely different, and you either need to recode your application and break all your dependencies and fuck over your users, or you need to continue to use some old broken version, right? So I think whilst ego might sound like a kind of bad idea, that the whole not invented here syndrome might be a genuine concern for people like that. Anthony, do you have anything?
Yeah, knowing the people involved firsthand, Matt Weirfeeney specifically, He's one of the ones that is lesser susceptible to that, in my opinion, in the sense of there are some very serious concerns with why they created PSR-7 instead of just using the kernel. I wasn't there specifically for that during the time, but I've had the conversation since. And part of the reason was they wanted a set of message objects that could be used both for send and receive, which Symfony wasn't really set up to be able to handle the receive side. Sorry, the send side, the client side. But the other one was Symfony was very much set up for the entire request at one time, and hence you create this object, which could make other types of more advanced use cases significantly more difficult. An example of that would be if we wanted to build an HTTP server inside of PHP, where you actually were taking HTTP off the line. Something similar and akin to how Node works or how React and Icicle and all of these things work. The Symfony message system, it may not be the most ideal for that for a couple of different reasons. It just wasn't designed for that, and that's one of the factors that was kind of included in the PSR-7 design, and one of the things that led to that. So I think it's just a complicated and nuanced system. It's not, there aren't clear benefits either way to just standardize Symfony or just standardize, but I think they do solve a little bit of a different problem.
I think it's also worth pointing out that when you go and have the input of a large, diverse group of different frameworks and people working on things, you do end up with a lot of different perspectives. And to just rubber stamp Symfony's implementation as HTTP messages in general for PHP is not necessarily ideal, because there's probably things even in Symfony, you get down into the multiple versions down the road, and there are probably things you want to change about a system. And so to take a greenfield approach and really say, well, what is the best thing that we can do, and what do we see happening in the future, and what implementation will best suit everyone in the future, is a pretty reasoned and I think a good way to go. And so I'm quite happy with the way PSR-7 turned out, and I'm really happy to see the adoption that is happening so far. The early adopters have been producing some really interesting stuff that works all across the board for a lot of different people and in a lot of different use cases, which is kind of the mission of FIG. So I would say that's pretty successful so far.
All right. For a little background, I guess, on 15 in particular, is where is it at in process? Is this ratified? Is it still being voted on? Is it still in discussion phase? Kind of how far along is it? And do we see any major changes coming before it's out in the wild?
PSR-15 has passed the entrance vote, which means that it is in the editing phase currently. I am the editor on it, and we have been working through a number of things. It's already changed fairly dramatically since it was first proposed. And so FIG will continue to work on it and edit it for some time. I don't see a lot more radical changes coming to it at this point. I think it's pretty solid. There are still a couple of details that people are working through in regards to how some specific things happen with the stack container, as we call it, which holds the middleware that you start processing the request through. So we'll probably deal with those, but other than that, I think it's pretty solid at this point, and it's, like I said, it's come a long way. Originally the proposal for PSR-15 was based on what was already the de facto standard that was happening out there. It was taken from more or less from Express.js, and then implemented in Send Expressive. And so that implementation is what we call the double pass approach. It's very different than the StackPHP Symfony HTTP kernel approach, which is more of a Lambda style approach. So the double pass approach basically a signature is that you have a function that takes a request interface, a response interface, and a callable. The callable is then used to execute the next middleware in the stack until there are none left. So that was
pretty similar to Express, right? Where you basically just have the next, and you're constantly calling the next.
Exactly. It's exactly like Express. Pretty much exactly like Express. So that was the de facto standard, and when we first proposed PSR-15, we thought, this is obvious. We should just standardize something that's already out there in the wild. Everybody can agree. It'll take 10 seconds to implement for all of these people that are doing middleware right now, and we can all go home and call it a day and have a beer. That was quickly shot down by Anthony. And Anthony is not a FIG member, but he was pretty vocal in why that was not a good idea. And his arguments were really good. Anthony, do you want to talk about why you were unhappy with that approach?
Yeah, so I mean, there were a couple different issues with it. Things that stemmed from like bike shedding things like method naming, which we ultimately discussed, and whether it matters or doesn't matter. But the big issue that I wound up having with it was when you pass both a request and a response into a method in a deeper middleware, there becomes this really interesting challenge where when I'm writing a middleware, I don't know what that response that gets passed into me as a parameter means, right? So if I assume it's a complete empty response, then that's one thing. If I assume it's a success case, it's another thing. And if I assume it's all responses, that's a third thing. And that ambiguity I theorized, could lead to some pretty significant issues. This became a pretty big Reddit thread and went back and forth. Someone went through a lot of the packages you had mentioned earlier of people who created these middleware packages and found all the ones that modified the response prior passing into the next one. And when we looked at it, we were actually able to come up with cases for all but one of them where we could actually get the system into an inconsistent state based upon the order with which we executed middleware or something like that. So one of the big things that I pushed back, I think the major design decision that I was really trying to push for, and we ultimately, came to, I think, a good end at, was that it's the more Lambda style is safer for the developers because the meaning is clearer. It may be a couple extra lines of code and require, a factory where in the past you didn't require a factory, but the code becomes a lot more predictable. And ultimately, when we're talking about standards bodies, to me, predictability is the bigger factor. If we're doing a micro framework where, code length and implementation ease is the predominating driver, then the other methods make more sense. Specifically, if you're targeting an audience that's used to Express.js. But so I saw that issue and I raised it. We had a couple discussions online. I know Rustuck was also passionate about it. We talked about it on List for a while, and then there were a couple blog posts. Things got a little bit unnecessarily heated. Not too bad, I don't think, but a little bit unnecessary. But ultimately, we hit a good spot in the end. So I want to thank you for that.
Well, thanks. I think for me, the real turning point was when it became clear. There basically was a blog post after Anthony and I had gone back and forth about this a little bit on Twitter. We had written some blog posts about it, and somebody else wrote a blog post pointing out that the stream interface of PSR-7 is not immutable. And so you can get into this state where one middleware has written something to the stream, and then an exception happens. The exception handler kicks in, which in most micro frameworks that use PSR-7 is also a middleware, and it assumes that the response is totally empty, which is the point that you were just kind of making, Anthony, where you don't know what the response state is, and so you have to make assumptions about it. And so that exception handler assumes the response is empty, writes something to it, and now you have either a incomplete response or you have a response that's been corrupted because the exception handler wrote something that was shorter than the original message body, and because the underlying stream doesn't have a way to clear the entire response unless you completely replace it, you now have this unknown situation where you have a partial response written in with an exception message in the middle of it, or in the beginning of it, and then some other stuff at the end, which may or may not even be the same content type as what you wanted. And so when I looked at that and I was like, wow, there is no way around that. You know, we have to resolve that properly, and you can't resolve that by just taking the response and making a new copy of it. You know, because with everything else in PSR-7, most things except for these streams, you just make a copy, you overwrite it, move on with your life. Because that's not possible with a stream, and you can't create a new instance of a stream, we kind of end up in a situation where a factory is an absolute necessity. And that's, once you have a factory, then there's no reason to do the double pass approach, because all of the points that you were making about it being safer and more predictable and not having to make assumptions are completely valid. You know, my biggest resistance was this whole idea that we don't need a factory because we already have an empty response. But if we can't know what that response is, then we do have to have a factory. There's no other way about it.
One thing that I wanted to ask you, fellas, it just for the kind of the layperson at home that doesn't really understand what a lot of these terms mean, one concrete example of something that might be a problem I feel like was discussed in the various blog posts is like when you have a series of middlewares and one of them is setting a caching header, and then the other one says, oh, something's wrong here, we're going to set an error message, and it changes the content type and sets that it's a 422 whatever, and sets the stuff in there. And then because it's combined with cache headers plus, you know, the actual body is set, you've now cached an error message. Is that one of the things that you're concerned about? Is that resolved in this kind of new approach of how things work, or not?
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, just another example of kind of the situation where you don't know what state the response is in. When you get that response, you either have to inspect it a whole bunch in all of your middleware code to see what state it's in and then make some changes based on that state, or you have to assume it's an empty response. And for the most part, middleware that exists out there today is just assuming that it's an empty response, and each middleware can do whatever it wants with it. But you know, as Anthony said, there's a whole list of middleware out there that proves that that's not what's actually happening.
And to be fair, I just want to point one thing out. It's not that those authors who made it, that modified it beforehand, were bad or weren't smart or anything like that. There are actually some incredibly smart people building some incredibly complex systems that function really, really well. It's just the nature of that design that tends to favor those potential issues, and you know, it can get you into a corner. So, yeah.
Right. I mean, it's really hard to, when you're just looking at a single middleware and you're like, oh yeah, I'll just set this header here, that makes perfect sense, and you're not thinking about the exception case. You know, it's not that you're doing something wrong. It's just that you're not thinking about all the possible scenarios that middleware could be executed in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've done the exact same thing. Like in Go, you have to pretty much build this entirely yourself. There are a few things that have been made recently, but when I was doing that, it was do it yourself, and I definitely cached some error messages. So it can totally happen without you even really thinking about it. And for those of you listening at home, I just said Go, so drink. So this kind of leads us on to another thing of seeing as you've had this differentiation. There's two different major ways of building middleware. There's probably a million, but there were two main approaches that were originally being kind of outlined by Anthony and by Woody. And Anthony pointed out that, you know, the approach that he was suggesting was very similar to the way that Beau did things with StackPHP. So well done, Beau. But there's these two major approaches to how you do things, and a lot of different implementations have done them either A or B or C or D or F. When you are deciding on how to kind of shape the standard of PSR-15, Woody, how do you decide how you weigh the existing implementations versus kind of telling them how to do stuff? So if there's a bunch of implementations out there that currently do things in one way, and then you create a standard that says you have to do it the other way, is that going against the nature of the FIG, which standardizes how things currently work, or is that kind of helping people avoid the problems that have been discussed by you folks, and giving them the chance to kind of move in a logical step forward to avoid just making shit code be the standard? How do you weigh those up?
I mean, first of all, I don't think the FIG has ever been in the position of just standardizing the status quo and calling it good. I think the FIG acts as a roundtable, and where everybody says this is how we're doing things, and then they discuss what the best way to actually move forward is. And I would say that's actively happening with PSR-15 and PSR-17 right now, because we did have the status quo of a double pass approach, and then to look at how that works within Express, and then to consider StackPHP and that approach, and all of the concerns that Anthony raised, are totally valid. And so I think that's how we're moving forward right now, and I'm pretty happy with the process at this point. So to actually answer your question in terms of how are people going to feel about this, part of the goal that I have with PSR-15 is, as we get closer towards an acceptance vote and actually saying that this is a published standard, is including methods and perhaps even some helper classes with the interfaces that will allow people to wrap their existing double pass style middleware and get the correct implementation out of it. It's trivial. It takes, it's like, ends up being about 5 lines of code to take an existing double pass middleware and wrap it in such a way that it can be executed in a Lambda style. And so I think that's going to be a good stepping stone for existing middlewares to publish something that's compatible without having to worry about it too much, and then gives them a road to move forward into a PSR-15 fully compatible middleware.
So there's one thing I want to throw out here. Phil, you had said that there's really 2 predominant methods, the double pass and the Lambda style. There actually is a third one that's used by Rust in Iron, the Iron framework, which is, and I'll post the link in IRC, but the basic concept there is they have 3 different middleware. You have what they call the around middleware, which is basically the Lambda approach. You have the before middleware, which acts kind of like just a flat pipeline where you can modify the request, but you can't touch the response because you don't get the response. All it is called with the request. And then the after, which gets a request and a response, but altering the request does nothing. So basically it sets up a pipeline where in the beginning you can modify the request. In the middle, you can modify the request and the response. You can also short circuit, etc. And then at the end, you can only modify the response, but the response is passed to you after it's been handled. So it kind of really sets up the 3 different contracts. And there was somebody who was looking to propose this as 15, but that kind of fell around. It's an interesting model, but it's also a lot more complicated.
Yeah, it sounds a lot more complicated.
Exactly. Yeah, and I mean, that was proposed in part of the PSR-15 mailing list discussions. Somebody did mention that before. And I like it. It's well structured. It's just very hard, especially with the existing implementations that are out there right now. It would be very hard to define a set of helpers that would easily translate those things right now. And so I think you lose some of the flexibility that we currently have in the PSR-15 Lambda style spec by introducing more layering and more structure around it to adopt that style.
All right, so I want to pose another question. I'll throw this up to Beau. Are there any current issues with the PSR as you see it? Anything that you're concerned about or want addressed before it moves forward?
Honestly, one of the things that I did with PSR-7 was I tried to not get too involved in the daily switchings of everything around. Just because it's the people who are actually working on it more actively are fielding a lot of stuff, and a lot of things end up getting changed. So I definitely like the direction that things are going now. So it feels more comfortable based on being similar to Stack. Yeah, so I think it's going in the right direction. So I don't think that anything needs to change. I don't think it's finished yet, but it definitely seems like it's going in the right direction.
All right, Anthony, any changes you would like to see or any concerns?
No, I mean, I think the recent iterations, we could bike shed on stupid things like naming conventions or something like that. But honestly, I don't think that's worth the time and effort that it takes to go down that. Structurally, it looks a heck of a lot better. From a type safety standpoint, everything is enforceable, where everything's analyzable, which were two of my big concerns with the original proposal. And it looks like it's structured well and documented well. I haven't really dug too deep onto the rest of the proposal outside of the middleware. That's something that's been on my list for too long, but otherwise, yeah, no, it seems good to me.
By the rest of the proposal, are you referring to PSR-17?
No, I was more specifically talking about the, I forget what you called it, the interface that runs the middleware.
The frame interface?
No,
or the container?
The container.
The stack container?
Yeah, that was it.
Sure.
Again, not seeing anything wrong with it, just I haven't looked at it too deeply because the initial path I took looked reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, that is really the kind of one remaining issue is deciding if PSR-15 should also define a middleware container as the entry point and for part of the frame or not. I don't feel like there's a strong resolution one way or the other. Personally, I feel like it's important just because it illustrates some of the reasoning around why the middleware interfaces are defined the way that they are and having client versus server middleware. But we'll see how that plays out. It may be that there is no interface. There's just documentation around what the code could potentially look like. So I think that's important.
Just to quickly clarify terminology, because I haven't looked at the code for this.
Sure.
Frame, is that the snapshot of the stream at that point in time, or what is the frame in this case?
Okay. Right. So there's the middleware interface itself, which takes a request. It's a function that takes a request and a frame interface and produces a response interface. The frame interface is essentially what the callable next was in Express. So rather than just having a plain callable, we've defined a frame interface, which then you pass the request onto to continue processing the middleware. And if you don't call the frame interface, then you're essentially aborting early and cutting off the pipeline and turning it around at that point, rather than allowing the stack to finish.
Okay, so does it completely kill the stack, or does it kill that iteration? Like, what happens in an async environment where you might have more than one frame at once?
In a middleware system, in this there might be multiple frames, but it would just be that particular call path. Okay. So that particular call path for the pipeline, by not calling the next frame interface, you're aborting early. So that's the type of situation where, if you run into, if you have caching or something,
it's like a stack that you're popping on and off of? Is that basically it?
We use the term stack just because of StackPHP. I think it's sort of familiar. It's not a traditional stack. It's not a traditional queue because it's more like an onion, which has been kind of the analogy for a long time. And so each layer of the onion is what we call a frame. And so that frame interface is giving you the pathway into the next layer of the onion going down. And then when you return, you're exiting out layers of the onion. Did you want to add something to that, Anthony?
Yeah.
Maybe you have a better analogy.
Well, no. I was just going to say more formally, it's a proxy design pattern from Gang of Four, where each middleware becomes a proxy for either the middleware underneath it or the ultimate handler that the framework or whatever it is implementing. Really straightforward, and some of them look like decorators if they just always pass, but the proxy is the superset thereof.
Right, and that kind of explains, why we're having this debate about what the naming, the byte shedding issue that Anthony was talking about earlier is kind of about this. How do we name things so that people understand what we're talking about when we say frames and we have a stack container and we're doing next and things like that?
Yeah, that's why I wanted to kind of pause there because my brain goes to a certain place when you say stack and frame, but that apparently wasn't correct. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually do have a question about the proposal, and it's somewhat related to what Anthony mentioned about the iron framework stuff. I just checked that out, and it has this notion of a handler in it. Is there anything in PSR-15 that is close to the handler, like the final thing, what we would look at as like a controller or something like that?
Yeah, not at all. PSR-15 and HTTP middleware in general has avoided that completely. And I would say that our meta document doesn't explicitly say this, but that's a non-goal for PSR-15. We are absolutely not trying to specify what the innermost handler looks like and how you would actually end up calling your domain level code. So any middleware at any point, whatever the final middleware is in your stack or your queue, however you want to talk about it, would be the one that would be responsible for ultimately calling the domain code. We did also have a question that came in on IRC here. The question was, what is the preferred place for review and feedback right now? GitHub, if you read through the proposals and you see a typo, you can comment on GitHub. I don't think there's any open pull requests right now, but generally speaking, any feedback you have should go to the PHP-FIG mailing list. Creating issues on GitHub will not be useful at this point. So please post the mailing list if you have some feedback or something you want to say about PSR-15 or 17.
Is there a discussion thread people should reply in, or should they start a new topic?
Yep, we do have a PSR-15 feedback, I think it is called. So yes, there is an existing thread for that. I should also mention, we've been talking about PSR-17, but we haven't actually defined what that is. Yeah. As I was saying earlier, it became clear that we have a factory problem in middleware, because if we need to generate a response, which is what the current proposal says we need to do, the only way to do that without being bound to a specific implementation of PSR-7 is to have a factory. And so PSR-17, numbering not necessarily a coincidence, is essentially an extension to PSR-7 that defines a set of factory interfaces for creating PSR-7 HTTP message objects. And I see these two proposals as being essentially sister proposals. They really, PSR-17 is ultimately going to have to be released before or at the same time as PSR-15 for it to be really effective, because we need that we need a method, we need an interface, we need some sort of contract by which we can create new, particularly stream objects, but really all PSR-7 objects for this to be really successful. So there's one interface for each, one factory interface for each of the message objects that defines the minimum viable parameters that must be passed for it to be a valid object. For instance, in a response, you have to have a status code. You don't have to have content because 201 created, or 204 no content doesn't have any content, and so the status code is the only thing that is necessary in that kind of a situation. Other interfaces define the requirements. For a file uploaded implementation, there's a lot more requirements. So that's what PSR-17 is HTTP factory proposal, which also has been passed the entrance vote and is in editing stage right now. Have you looked at that at all, Anthony? Are you?
I took a casual look when I first saw it, and it looked straightforward enough.
I mean, the biggest question that's been coming up with that is how do we define what the minimum requirements are? And so it's been a lot of looking at the current existing popular implementations and how they differ and what their requirements are and that sort of thing.
I mean, that's the difficult part with it all, right? I mean, you have to have it usable when it comes out of the factory, but at the same token, you don't want to set too much, and you don't want to be too overly draconian about it. It might be worthwhile to actually split it apart and have two sets of factories. One that's more of a traditional factory where you just take in just the parameters and you let the user wire it up, kind of like what you have now, but then also taking another approach of a builder, which solves some of the stateless problems that people have been bringing up about PSR-7, which, like, for example, I don't believe is a problem, but some people do cite that it creates a lot of unnecessary objects. So it might be worthwhile creating a builder as well that could present something like a fluid interface that you call build at the very end to get you back that completed object. I don't know, just throwing things out here right now.
Right. Yeah. Somebody actually commented on that early on when the factory was proposed, and they basically said, why isn't it a builder? And my response at that point was that HTTP messages are essentially builders in and of themselves. Once you have the minimum requirements, all of the with methods are creating new objects and are effectively your builder for you. So to have to define all of those methods and then force all the PSR-7 implementations to, or not force, but ask them to implement all these additional builder methods when they're sort of baked into PSR-7 didn't make a lot of sense to me. Maybe I just haven't seen a good argument for them, but at this point I don't really see why that would be a necessity. But who knows? If somebody has a good example, I'd love to hear about it.
I'm actually pretty excited about the factories. Because all of the PSR-7 work that I've been doing, both from the client side and on the server side, a lot of it has been kind of tricky trying to construct the objects, but not really constructing them, but taking something that's already there and changing it the right way. And it's one of the weird things if you look at, say, like a URI, and if you consider that we're kind of treating the PSR messages as value objects, if you change, say, just the host first, you haven't really created a consistent correct URI anymore. It's not correct until you then also change the path, maybe, or then also maybe the scheme. So it is interesting that people do treat them sort of as builder objects, and it can be really easy to think that you're doing something safe with these objects, but it does feel a little dirty sometimes when you're trying to work with an existing object and just changing the bits around, and now you've got something new. But in between there, you didn't have something that was correct. It's been kind of awkward to go through some of that. So I'm hoping to see that the factory sort of remove that sort of awkwardness from working with PSR-7.
Yeah, and I think in general, I think people have. What was I going to say? People have made the assumption. PSR-7 implementations have made the assumption that they kind of have to do their best to create valid things at creation when an object is instantiated. And so if you look at like Guzzle's URI implementation or Slim or Diactoros, like they all have to end up making these certain assumptions in order to try and create something that's valid based on what you pass in, or even just if you don't pass in anything, they kind of have to fake a sort of a valid thing, or they have to throw exceptions when you try to build a URI that's invalid, and it's kind of been a mess. So I am also hopeful that PSR-17 will kind of help make that a little bit more clear, and by having a standard, we'll have somewhat of a more consistent approach to those value objects. Somebody asked on IRC, notable people in the community have been frowning upon the idea of standardizing factories. Could anyone elaborate on why that would be considered a bad idea? I haven't been hearing specific concerns about that. So if if anybody else wants to take a gander at that, I don't have anything to add about that. I think that PSR-17 is a good addition to what we already have with PSR-7 and helps address the ambiguity. And because we don't have a common implementation to work with, it's the best we can do.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. I'm not the biggest fan of standardizing factories and in general, because I think it removes a lot of the design pressure to build simple systems. Once you start saying, well, we can add a factory to make it easy, all of a sudden the complexity of what you're introducing, what you're trying to standardize goes through the roof. I don't think that's the situation here. I think the situation here is you have a complex domain. I mean, HTTP messages, if you've ever read the spec, it's a very, very, very complicated domain. PSR-7 does a great job trying to simplify it, but there's only so much simplification you can do, and therefore adding a factory is the realization that the domain is overly complicated. In general, I would try to avoid it because I think good object-oriented designs shouldn't need it. But I think this is just one of those cases where the underlying domain is the problem, meaning to solve that problem, you'd have to fix HTTP itself, which isn't happening.
Yeah, I mean, on that, you know internals better than I do, Anthony. Do you think that I can't remember the name of the RFC now, RFC that was basically proposing functions that could implement class interfaces would be a kind of a good middle ground for some of these systems where you don't necessarily want to rely on another package and a whole set of classes for a factory, but then you can use these functions that implement existing interfaces to do the work for you?
I see zero benefit to it. With anonymous classes, what is the benefit? You save one declaration line of instantiation, but what do you gain from it? You gain a lot less type safety. You get a lot more complicated of a type system. I wasn't a fan of that when I saw it. The one that I think would be ridiculously helpful here, yet nobody on internals that I've seen seems to appreciate the power of and hence argue very vehemently against it, are algebraic types. So very specifically intersection types in this case, because then you could define your factories as literal single interfaces with a single method, making them really easy to implement. And then when you're building your middleware, you just type int against the specific one that you need rather than the whole collection of them. And then hence, interface segregation principle really becomes really, really, really powerful. And it works both ways on the and on the or. to say, I want a URI and a request factory, and you could get an object that implements all 5 of them, but I don't know. It's that particular one I think would be a lot more useful. Yet the type system kind of continues to have no strong direction other than who's willing to drive it. So.
Right. And in some ways it does add an additional level of user complexity, which, that's just a matter of users getting used to it and understanding it. But it does add a level of complexity to the type system that we don't currently have. Yeah, I'm kind of running out of things to talk about. I think that's kind of where we're at with HTTP middleware, and I'm excited to see it get wrapped up along with HTTP Factory. And I hope that if people have feedback about it, they will come to the mailing list or message me on Twitter or something and let me know.
Sweet. One last question, Beau. You have been working on middleware stuff for a fairly long time, and as part of StackPHP, what are some of the coolest middlewares that you saw people make? Because there's been a whole bunch of stuff on there. There's OAuth, there's all sorts of things. What do you like?
Oh, wow.
What do you think? I can just give you an extra bit of rambling, because like a lot of people think about middleware and they're like, I don't know what you're fucking talking about. What is middleware? What can it be used for? Well, we've been talking about this for the last hour. We haven't actually talked about a use case of what it might actually be used for. So, if you could kind of think of a few that you've used it for, and even if not in PHP, in like other languages.
Yeah. So as one of the interesting ones that is a little easier for people to follow, I think, is like a GeoIP sort of thing, where each request can get a IP address header added to the request when it's inbound. Those sorts of things aren't necessarily safe. You shouldn't use those for any actual security things. But if you need extra metadata, that's the kind of thing that you can add pretty easily to a middleware. Just add it before you pass it on to next, and you're good to go. I think Cores is an interesting middleware. It's probably the most useful one that I've seen. I think there might be a PSR-7 implementation of that now as well. I wrote a simple little fake one to just automatically whitelist everything, and that was really interesting to just be able to write that in like 7 lines of code, and all of a sudden my app was Cores aware in development, completely open for the world.
Yeah.
What's another interesting one? Probably my favorite middleware was one fixing Diactoros cookies. I was using request instead of server request, and Diactoros for a little while didn't actually store cookies. Like it didn't transfer the cookies super global into the header when you generated a request from global. So I wrote a little middleware that looked to see if I can't remember exactly how I fixed it, but basically I was able to patch Diactoros' implementation locally to automatically write the cookie headers for me.
That's nice.
Yeah, so those are the types of things that this whole idea of middleware is kind of abstract, but you can find a lot of ways to use it once you start digging around and realize you can do whatever you want to the messages before your controller actually gets them, and you can do whatever you want to after the controller creates a response. So you can do a lot of really interesting and useful things once you start thinking about things at that level.
Yeah, by we, I mean the company I work for. We actually have a framework, a PSR-7 framework that's out there right now called Equip, which we're actively building some microservices on. And we've done everything from token-based authentication to routing to session management, all through middleware. We basically use middleware as effectively the entirety of the framework, and then we just have one middleware that's specific to our needs that then calls into the domain code and just fetches a blob of data. Content negotiation and everything is done in the middleware. So the middleware, once that blob of data is coming back out, the middleware actually looks at the headers and decides what content type to format it as. So we have a number of different formatters. We can format as JSON in JSON API format, or XML, or HTML, and we don't have to worry about that. We just rely on the incoming request to decide what content type it wants, and if we don't understand the content type that the client is asking for, we just give them JSON, because that makes sense.
Yeah, it's pretty much what we've done as well. We've built our entire stack off of PSR-7 middleware, so there isn't actually a full framework anywhere. There isn't even really a micro framework. It's just a collection of PSR-7 middleware. They're using the double pass format right now, but as soon as PSR-15 gets completed, we'll probably just switch everything over, and I don't imagine that would take longer than half a day to switch everything. So, yeah, it's you can build the entire application just based off of PSR-7 based middleware.
Yeah, and that's what I think is so cool about the ecosystem. If we end up in the situation where you can just pick and choose middlewares that you need, building effectively a quote-unquote full-stack framework becomes super fast, because you can just decide what kind of middleware you need in order to build that, whether you need content negotiation or cores or whatever else, and you just pull it in and write your domain stuff and throw a blob of data back out, and everything just works as kind of the holy grail I see.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the major benefits I see of the middleware stuff in general, and I think it's one of the most accurate to the goals of what the FIG was set up for in general, of all of the things to come. I know a lot of people think that the FIG should have shut up after it did like PSR 0 and maybe PSR 1, and then after that PSR 2 was probably done. But I think a lot of frameworks have re-implemented a lot of the same basic functionality over and over again. So stuff like cores, a lot of frameworks have released and they're like, actually we don't know how you do cores, figure that shit out yourself. And in early versions of Laravel, you'd have to like make a specific route file that would handle all options, and then it would kind of do some stuff from there, and you do it yourself. And then eventually they're like, that sucks, let's add this feature in, and they work on it. Like, we can do better than that, let's try and do it again. And they slowly improve it over time, and they've got all these different frameworks working on all these identical features and over again, when they could just be like, we'll just include this thing that does that. And I think that's exactly what the FIG is about. It's about not it's about making it so the PHP ecosystem can provide the functionality itself that can be used by the entire PHP ecosystem, instead of making every single framework reinvent and re-envision and re-implement every single feature over and over and over again ad nauseum, and then redo it for later versions and then redo it again. Because if there's 10 different frameworks and they all have 3 different versions, that's 30 different versions of the same bloody feature. So I'm very happy to see the FIG working on middleware stuff. Yes.
Well, and the other thing that I would stress is to look outside of the ecosystem. Think outside of your application process boundary. All of the middleware, by definition, if it's modelable as an HTTP message, you can model your middleware as a separate application that proxies. Varnish is a perfect example of a caching middleware. It takes in a request. It might return a response that was cached. It might forward it along, get the response, cache it internally, and then return it. It's doing the exact same thing that the PHP code is doing. And it's funny that I believe it was Woody you mentioned that you have middleware doing authentication for you, etc. At my gig here at Grovo internally, we're using a services-oriented architecture. We've got about 25 to 30 different microservices between Go, Scala, and PHP-7. And the interesting thing is, if we took that approach and doing it in code, you'd have a lot of duplication because you'd have to handle authentication at every single service. And instead what we did, and I'll post the link into the IRC channel, is we picked an application called Tyke, which is an API gateway, which in a sense is just an HTTP middleware. And in fact, it has internal middleware that you can run as well, written in Go. But the concept is it handles all of our OAuth termination for us at the boundary. It handles rate limiting at the boundary. It handles all sorts of stuff. But it's just another middleware, and it's the same exact application architecture if you did it in your PHP application inside of a file, as if you have it as a separate service running somewhere else. It's the exact same model. And to me, there's some beautiful symmetry in that. You know, I like architectures that show symmetry and show patterns, and the fact that there's such a reverberating pattern to this, I don't know, really intrigues me and really shows that it's onto something interesting.
Sweet. And on that note, I think we've hit an hour exactly, which is pretty rare. Normally we either run out of things that are interesting to say or bang the fuck on for 2 hours. But that's been a pretty good chat about PSR HTTP middleware stuff. I know a lot of people haven't been following the ongoing discussion and probably won't want to follow the entire discussion for the entire way through, because these PSRs take a lot of work. They take a lot of time. I'm happy to see that there's so many different people with different approaches that are starting to come together and work past the problems, get past maybe the heated parts, and onto the constructive part that comes after that. And I'm really confident that this PSR won't be a repeat of the cache PSR that took, I think it took 24 years. Is that accurate? I think it's 24, 25 somewhere. But I'm glad to see that we're doing a lot better. And when I say we, I mean you guys, because I have piss all to do with the FIG these days, apart from being an observer, a spectator, and commentator. But you're doing a wonderful job. And on that note, I'm going to bed because it's 1:15. England just lost to Iceland, for fuck's sake, and I'm tired and drunk.
Iceland has
on that. No one else wants to say bye. Okay. I'm so lonely.
All right. Thanks, Bill. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. All right, I'm going to click